firstly start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, elders past and present. Can I acknowledge also and thank Eric Howard for the invitation to speak here tonight. Eric comes from he's a member of an illustrious family from Western Victoria, the Howard family, none of whom are related to the Prime Minister, which gives me great pleasure. Can I thank him for the invitation to speak? Can I also acknowledge the Irish Ambassador, Brendan O'Quilly, and your partner, Carmel, Frank Brennan, who Frank and I share an old mutual friend, now sadly deceased, Emmett Costello, who I can say this because Emmett wouldn't mind me saying it, who once said to me about Tony Abbott, "He lacks judgment, Buster." And he was right. But good to see you, Frank. Can I also, it's great to see Steve Howard, another member of the clan, who I knew very well in my days in Canberra when I was Chief of Staff to John Fay, who was a very decent fellow and still is a very decent fellow, and of course had a lot to do with the Irish community in Australia, and he was very close to the Irish Embassy when I was in Canberra. I wanted to talk tonight, and I've been asked to talk tonight about democracy, and the words that Shane Howard sang to us earlier tonight about the politics of fear is something that we've heard. One more acknowledgement, I should acknowledge Michael Bean, the former President of the Senate, who's here tonight, and he's a President who didn't feel the need to resign, unlike the Undertaker of Burnie, as we call Steve Parry in Tasmania. That's what he was an Undertaker before he went into politics. He signed his own death warrant recently. But on more serious matters, Australian democracy should not be taken for granted. And the Scanlon Foundation survey recently that shows a decline in satisfaction with Australian democracy should be taken as a matter of great concern by the Australian community. Because democracy is not inevitable. Countries can very easily slide from democracy into authoritarian regimes. We have in this current government a minister who is, in my view, the most dangerously anti-democratic politician this country has seen for a long, long time. And I speak of Peter Dutton. And the reason I say this is this is a man who has no respect for the independence of the judiciary, who thinks that judges and members of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal who oppose his decisions are to be sneered at and ignored. I'll give you an example of his authoritarian tendencies. There's a recent decision of the full court of the Federal Court involving two New Zealanders, and Dutton has taken upon himself this godlike power to expel New Zealanders in particular who commit crimes. Often they've lived all their lives in Australia, but he sends them back to New Zealand because they fail the character test. In this case, what he did was to cancel the visas of two New Zealanders. They won their appeals in the full court of the Federal Court. That was at 4:15 in the afternoon. The judgment was handed down. At 10 to 8 that night in his Brisbane office, he was given two files, 300 pages each, in relation to these two men, to make a further decision about whether or not he would expel them based on the full court of the Federal Court decision. At 19 minutes past 8, he'd signed off on both briefs. This is a man who purports to read 600 pages in 29 minutes. They went back to the full court of the Federal Court, which was scathing about Dutton. Now the media, I wrote something on it on Crikey, the media has failed to report this, but this is really significant, that a Minister of State would so cavalierly deal with the rights of individuals and so cavalierly deal with the full court of the federal court. This is seriously dangerous. In relation to the A.J. Graham case, A.J. Graham, for whom I'd acted in the past, who was a bikie out of Tasmania, New Zealander, the High Court overturned a decision. Dutton had cancelled his visa 3 times. The High Court overturned it. Within an hour of the High Court's decision, he cancelled it again. The judgment runs to some 50 or 60 pages. This shows a contempt for the rule of law. In relation to Peter Dutton, can I say that the damage he has done to Australian democracy is manifest when one considers the reaction to him in New Zealand. Over the past few weeks, I've been involved in the Manus Island case with Ben Lomé, who's a very brave lawyer in Papua New Guinea, and Greg Toop, who's a remarkable character who was at Monash in the late 1960s with other good friends of mine such as Len Hart, Jim Bacon and others, and who's still agitating at the age of 69. We've been working on this case, and I've been doing quite a bit of media in New Zealand. The contempt by New Zealanders for Peter Dutton and the disbelief about Dutton is extraordinary. He said in relation to Jacinda Ardern, the new Prime Minister's offer of $3 million in urgent aid for the men on Manus, it's a waste of money. That's the damage that is done to Australian democracy by a person like Peter Dutton. And this is not a personal attack. This is about a person holding a very high office in this country with enormous powers who acts in the manner of someone better suited to an authoritarian state and who has really a great contempt for democracy, if you think about it. Because if you don't understand and believe in the rule of law, then you have contempt for democracy. There was a book written some 10 years ago now by Tom Bingham, who was a famous judge in the United Kingdom, called The Rule of Law. And I get my jurisprudence students to read it every year. It's a slim volume. Tragically, he died shortly after publication, but he sets out the fundamental principles of the rule of law in a democratic society. And when you go through them, Australia has breached each and every one of them in the last 10 years. Anti-terror laws, and I was involved in the so-called Melbourne terrorism case in 2007 and 2008. Anti-terror laws in this country strip away the rights of courts to make decisions, broaden the definition of what is or should be considered to be criminal activity to an extent that is unprecedented, and perhaps most concerningly, now allow for the detention of children as young as 10 without them being charged with a criminal offence. We have since 9/11 passed over 70 pieces of legislation concerning terrorism. And every time laws are passed, politicians will tell you, Labor and Liberal, and I have to say, the Greens have been the only party with any principle on the issue. They've consistently opposed these laws. But these politicians will tell you, we need these laws to keep our communities safe. And they've said that now on 75 occasions. Where's the end point? Those of you more familiar with Ireland than I am, and most particularly the Ambassador, will know that the United Kingdom did not win the war against the IRA. It was not the fundamentally flawed legal system that led to the horrendous conduct of the British legal system in the Birmingham 6 and Guildford 4 cases. You don't win these battles by stripping away the rule of law, stripping away rights. What's even more concerning in Australia is that our courts, in my view, have been prepared to go along for the ride. I can't help but say this, when Frank's father was on the court, and Anthony Mason and other judges, one can't imagine that the High Court of Australia would have, as it did in 2005 in Mowbray and Thomas, or 2006 I think, allowed for orders which enable people to be controlled in terms of their movements and with whom they associate without them being charged with a criminal offence. But that's exactly what the High Court did in Mowbray and Thomas. And Michael Kirby said, and has said to me privately, that he was shocked at his colleagues, how willingly they went along with the government's agenda of excusing what was inexcusable as a matter of law. That is, that you can restrict a person's movements, that you can interfere in their lives without a criminal offence having been committed. But it was no surprise to Michael Kirby, because in 2005 he had opposed what has now become de rigueur on both sides of politics, and that is this idea of preventative detention, another offender against the rule of law. The idea that a person who has committed a criminal offence and who is then sent to jail, and it is the court that determines the appropriate penalty, is something that we all took for granted. But since, and the history of this is interesting, since the Gary David case in Victoria in 1991, and some of you may remember that case, we have taken it upon ourselves in our legislatures to now keep people locked away beyond the date that the court said they ought to be released. And we do it for sex offenders, and we now do it enthusiastically, supported by both sides of politics in relation to those who've committed terrorism offences. We say we're not going to release these people if they haven't renounced their beliefs. Does that sound like a democratic society to you? Michael Kirby said of these types of laws that their genesis was Nazi Germany. I'm not exaggerating. Have a look at Farben's case and have a look at what he said. The genesis of preventative detention laws is Nazi Germany. Undesirable people are kept under lock and key after or irrespective of any term of imprisonment by a court. The courts have to stand up against this, and far too many judges, as I said, are going along for the ride. In the Northern Territory in particular, and in Western Australia and in Queensland, it is the rates of Indigenous incarceration, as we know, are the highest in the world. We jail more people, Indigenous Australians that is, than Americans do in respect of African Americans. And the courts are going along for the ride. I know that it's said by judges that their role is not to make law, their role is to interpret the law, their role is to ensure that the law is enforced. But, and without getting too technical, that's the evil of what's called positivism in the law. That is that morality doesn't matter. You've just got to, if it's law, it's law. We saw in the High Court in the 1990s a move away. We saw an opportunity in that court of Anthony Mason and Gerard Brennan and Bill Dean and others to try and invest some human rights into the Australian Constitution. The reward they got was a blatant political stacking of the court by the Howard government. And the Labor Party has been too afraid ever since to appoint people of intellectual adventure to the court. And so the High Court in Australia is a conservative body. One of my good friends and colleagues in the Northern Territory has got into enormous amounts of trouble recently. He's a silk up there, and in fact was one of the people who exposed the Dondale detention centre on Four Corners. Has got into enormous trouble over a speech he gave in which he said similar things. He's offended the judges and he's offended the legal profession. Well, if you don't offend and don't challenge, is a better word, to the judiciary and the legislature, then what will happen is that the decline in democracy will continue. The rubber stamping of laws by the courts, such as they did in Mowbray's case and in Farden's case, the failure of our courts to accord justice to people, to participate in the mass incarceration of not only Indigenous Australians, but here in Victoria, all Victorians at risk of mass incarceration. I might say as an aside, I found it amusing that Daniel Andrews said the other day, it's terrific in Victoria, we're such a progressive state, we've passed the right to die legislation, which I supported by the way, but we've passed that legislation and we were the top voters in marriage equality. This is the same Premier who at the start of this year, gleefully, to appease the Herald Sun, locked up young kids in Barwon prison. I mean, is that a progressive state? You think that's progressive? So, it is. My point is this, that it's not just our politicians. My profession is playing a part in this decline in democracy. The issue of imprisonment is an important one. You might say, well, what's imprisonment got to do with democracy? In a smart democracy, such as those which exist in Northern Europe, for example, you have evidence-based policy. You have policy which enhances the community and community well-being. And I think Eric said earlier, the role of government in democracy ought to be to enhance the community's well-being. That certainly was the philosophy of Bentham and Mill and others, but it's always been the philosophy of those who might regard themselves as traditional 19th century liberals. And that is that you want to enhance the commonwealth, not just in a commercial sense, in an economic sense, but in a social sense. In intelligent societies, incarceration is not only a last resort, but if it's used at all, it's a place where the sole focus is on rehabilitation. And why do you think in those societies you have lower recidivism rates, therefore enhancing the wealth of society? Why do you think in those states you have a better educated community? It's because they don't have that primitive notion of punishment which our democracy has inherited. We inherited it from the British, and it was probably inevitable because we started life as an outsourced prison camp. So, incarceration is part, of course, of the politics of fear. Let me turn lastly now to the issue of refugees. On the way here, Barbara, my wife, and I were coming down here. We had, as our Uber driver, I'm a great believer in freedom of choice in economic terms, which gets me into trouble with my friends on the left. But, we had a young Afghan fellow, boat person, who, when he got here, he's Hazara. And when he got here and he was detained in one of the gulags, known as immigration detention centres. By the way, I had a client recently who told me he'd rather be in jail than out at Maribyrnong immigration detention. That's how bad it is. How does that sound? Anyway, he said, he is Hazara. He said, the interviewer was a Pashtun. And of course, he said, they were the people we're fleeing from. And the interpreter was Pashtun. In other words, they were determined to keep him out. But the more important point is, he has lived here now for 6 years and has spent 3 years trying to get his wife and children out from Kabul. Well, in a democratic society, one that believes in the improvement of commonwealth and one that respects the right to family, which of course in many countries is enshrined in the Constitution, that wouldn't happen. You shouldn't have to wait 3 years for your family members to join you when you've taken a hazardous journey, built a new life for yourself. You shouldn't be in a position where the bureaucracy is so inert, or in the case of the Department of Immigration, seeming to take a view that we ought to keep them out rather than let them in. You know, again, what sort of democracy is it that does that? Australia loves to pride itself on its great democratic values. Well, when I look at Canada, when I look at New Zealand, when I look at some other countries around the world, this country's slipping. I mean, we've had now 20 years of sliding. It started under Howard, drove me out of the Liberal Party, and many others I might say, including former leaders such as Malcolm Fraser, Fred Chaney and others. It has not improved because we have allowed fear to dominate the discourse. Fear, the politics of fear, the stroking of the xenophobic underbelly that resides in every nation, not just Australia, has been allowed to take and develop deep roots. It has led to a conservatism and a conservative consensus, and I don't mean conservatism in the Burkean sense where you preserve what is good from the past and you make the appropriate changes for the future. One of the things about Edmund Burke, of course, is he's beloved of people like Tony Abbott. What he forgets, of course, Burke was a great supporter, as the ambassador would know, of the Irish Catholics in the 1780s and 90s when it was very unfashionable in London. He was a true conservative, not a reactive conservative. But what we've done is allow reactive conservatives to take hold of the agenda. The cancer is within both major political parties, and it has infected the judiciary and the legal profession to a much greater extent than it should. It has led to a cowardice on the part of the media, including the ABC, and it has led to this country being diminished in the eyes of the world. Don't for a moment think that Australia is not seen, and rightly so, as a pariah amongst democracies when it comes to human rights. It is seen that way, and deservedly so. But instead of ending on a pessimistic note, let me say that an organisation and the values of this organisation and the values of Eureka are the sorts of values to which this country can one day return. Australia was an outward-looking nation for many, many years. When Malcolm Fraser, when we had Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser, who, when he became Prime Minister, welcomed boat people to this country, supported sanctions on South Africa. He told me, by the way, that the only person around the cabinet table who opposed sanctions on South Africa was, guess who? John Winston Howard. What a surprise. We had under Bob Hawke and Paul Keating outward-looking leaders, particularly the latter. And what have we done? We've retreated. We can't even bring ourselves to deal respectfully with Indigenous people in this country. We can't even bring ourselves to come to terms with a treaty. We patted ourselves on the back about same-sex marriage, but let's remember, Canada did it in 2007. I was there when they did it. 2007. I mean, we're the Johnny-come-latelys in that debate. We got there, but we always get there afterwards. And yet, as Eric pointed out tonight, once upon a time, we were a leading democracy in the world. First Labor government in the world. One of the first places, I think, along with New Zealand, where women could vote. I've learned tonight, I didn't know that about the secret ballot. This was a progressive country. What has happened? It's organisations like this that can make it happen again, because nothing is inevitable. Democracy is not inevitable, conservatism is not inevitable, and it's certainly not inevitable that Australia has to be seen and perceived by the rest of the world as an outpost of Britain sitting at the bottom of the world, scared to face its future. Thank you very much.